Is there anyone truly capable of loving when everything in this world invites us to hate? Is there a soul brave enough to hope when every light has been extinguished and every door seems bolted shut by the heavy hand of despair? The Church answers that question with a single name, a name whispered by millions of lips across the centuries: Rita of Cascia. She was the woman who lived the impossible, not as a rare exception, but as her daily bread, her ordinary path to the heights of sanctity. Her story begins in a tiny, rugged village in the heart of the Italian Umbria, and from those jagged peaks, her light has reached the very ends of the earth, because the grace of God can never be contained in a single place. Chapter 1. The child of Roccaporena, high in the Apennine Mountains, in that region of central Italy where the air feels thin and holy, and the very stones seem to guard the silence of the ages. There existed a hamlet called Roccaporena. It was a place nearly forgotten by the world, tucked away between granite cliffs and ancient forests, where life moved only to the rhythm of the seasons and the steady tolling of the church bells. The people there were humble, farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen who understood the weight of manual labor and the true value of a faith inherited from their ancestors. It was there, in the year 1381, that a girl was born. The world would not know her for many years, but God had already set her apart, reserved for his own glory, before time itself began. Her parents, Antonio and Amata Lotti, were pillars of deep piety. Throughout the valley they were known by a beautiful title, the peacemakers. They were the mediators, the respected souls who stepped into the middle of bloody family feuds, offering their home and their words as a bridge between bitterness and reconciliation. For them, this vocation of peace was not a job, it wasn't a social role. It was the gospel lived out in the flesh. They understood that a single act of concrete love is worth more than 1,000 beautiful words. And it was in this domestic school of charity that little Rita would learn her very first lessons in holiness. But the birth of this child was marked by a miracle that the villagers would never forget. According to the stories passed down through generations, one afternoon, while the infant Rita slept in a basket near the fields, a swarm of mysterious white bees began to hover around her. The bees did not sting. Instead, they flew in and out of her tiny parted lips, as if they were depositing something precious, something invisible, a celestial nectar. A local farmer saw the scene and was struck with terror. He ran to find her parents, certain that the child was being suffocated or killed. But when they arrived, they found Rita in perfect peace. She was smiling, her face radiant, her breathing calm. From that day on, those white bees were seen as a sign from heaven, a symbol of the sweetness of doctrine that would one day flow from her lips, and the absolute purity of a soul chosen by God. As Rita grew, she showed a natural, almost magnetic pull toward prayer. While other children ran through the village paths, she preferred the quiet corner of the family chapel. She would sit there, with her eyes closed and her hands joined, in a state of contemplation that baffled those who watched her. She wasn't a sad child, or cold. No, she laughed, she played, she worked hard in the house. But there was a hidden dimension within her, something her neighbors could sense but never fully explain. It was as if a part of her always dwelt somewhere else, beyond what the eyes could see. As the years passed, that spiritual fire only grew brighter. Rita began to frequent the village church with a devotion that put the elders to shame. She fasted, she sacrificed small pleasures, she spent long, silent hours before the blessed sacrament, and in her teenage heart, a specific dream began to bloom, a desire that would haunt her entire life, to give herself entirely to God, to enter a convent. and vanish into a life of prayer. That dream, however, was about to collide with the loving will of her parents, and Rita would have to learn that sanctity rarely follows the map, that we draw for ourselves. Chapter 2. The Longing for the Cloister. The convent of the Augustinian nuns in Cascia wasn't far from her home, but for young Rita, it represented a different world entirely. It was the gateway to a life she felt she belonged to with her whole soul. The nuns lived a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a life of sacrifice. Ever since she was a little girl, every time her mind drifted toward those stone walls of the enclosure, she felt a warmth in her chest, like a glowing ember that refused to go out. This wasn't a childish whim. It wasn't romanticism. It was a calling, a thunderous whisper from the Most High. But her parents saw things differently. Antonio and Amata were now elderly. Their health was failing, and they looked at Rita, their only child, as the comfort of their old age and the only hope for their family line. They didn't oppose her faith. They were holy people themselves, but they could not accept her leaving. They wanted her close. They wanted her married. They wanted her surrounded by children of her own. To them, that too was a path to God. Rita found herself at a crossroads, a place of agonizing tension that many saints have walked before her, the tension between the voice in her heart and the duty of her obedience. The Church, in its wisdom, does not pit these two against each other. The fourth commandment is absolute. Honor thy father and mother. Rita, who had breathed the faith since her first breath, understood that the will of God might be found in the very obedience that was breaking her heart. She wept in the silence of the night. She prayed with a new, desperate intensity. And then she said yes. She would say yes to her parents before she could ever say yes to the convent. But this surrender was not passive. It was not a sign of defeat. Rita lived it as an act of active faith. She was convinced that God does not waste a single chapter of our lives. If the Lord truly wanted her in the convent, he would clear the path when the time was right. In the meantime, she would become a saint exactly where she was, with what she had, in the state of life she was called to endure. This internal posture, to obey without bitterness, to wait without despair, would become the very backbone of her spirituality. Rita was not a saint despite her circumstances. She became a saint through them. Her parents eventually found a husband for her, a man named Paolo Mancini. He came from a well-known family, but he was a man of fire, impulsive, aggressive, with a reputation for a violent temper. Most young women of that time would have seen this marriage as a death sentence. But Rita saw it as a mission. She prepared for her wedding day with the same solemnity, the same gravity, as if she were preparing to take her vows as a nun. She prepared with prayer, with fasting, and with a rock-solid resolution to love this man, just as Christ loves his church. That is to say, she would love him until the end, without conditions, and without ever giving up. Chapter 3. A Faithful Wife and the Mother of Grace. The day of her wedding, Rita crossed the threshold of the Mancini household, knowing she was entering a territory both untamed and dangerous. Paolo Mancini was a man of fire and stone, a man of quick temper and a tongue as sharp as a blade. In that 14th century Italy, where family names were defended with blood, Paolo was respected, but he was also feared. He carried the weight of ancient grudges and an iron pride that refused to bend for anyone. Yet Rita did not enter that home to conquer her husband. She did not come to reform him by force, nor to lament the hand that life had dealt her. She came to love him. With every ounce of patience and every drop of tenderness her soul could muster, the early years were a crucible of silence. Paolo would return from the fields, or from some heated dispute in the village square, his brow furrowed with rage, but Rita would meet him with nothing but serenity. When he raised his voice, she lowered hers. When the air in the room grew heavy with the threat of an explosion, she would interpose a kind word, a quiet smile, or a selfless gesture of service. Make no mistake, this was not weakness. It was the profound strength of one who knows that true love does not impose. It persuades. It does not scream. It transforms. Slowly, the neighbors who knew Paolo's volatile nature began to whisper in the streets of Roccaporena. Something in that house was different. The man of fire was being cooled by the steady rain of a woman's grace. Rita had turned her home into a domestic church, a sanctuary of prayer. Long before the sun touched the mountain peaks, she was awake, lost in her morning meditation. She wove her day between the heavy labor of the household and moments of deep interior recollection. She fasted as the church prescribed, and she fed the hungry who knocked at her door, sharing the little they had with a joyful heart. Paolo, who at first watched her with indifference, and sometimes with an edge of impatience, found himself slowly penetrated by her example. Rita's faith was not a private hobby. It was a living flame that warmed the entire house. And that flame, over the years, finally began to melt the hardened casing around her husband's heart. Their marriage bore fruit. 2 sons who filled the stone house with the sound of laughter and movement. Rita raised them with the same gentle constancy she had used to win over their father. She taught them to make the sign of the cross, to pray the rosary, and to see Christ in the poor. But more than the outward forms of devotion, she taught them the sacred reality of the everyday, that God is found in the breaking of bread, in the forgiveness offered and the mercy received. Those children were her private cloister, her way of living a consecrated life in the middle of a chaotic world. As the years passed, Paolo Mancini became a new man. His character did not change overnight. Strong temperaments rarely do, but his heart had been softened. He learned to respect Rita, to admire her, and eventually to love her with a tenderness his younger self would never have understood. Those who knew them called it a silent miracle, the miracle of a woman who didn't wait for perfect circumstances to become a saint, but used the struggles of a difficult marriage as the very raw material of her holiness. Chapter 4. The Widow of Forgiveness. The peace of that home, built with so much sweat and so many tears, was shattered in a single afternoon. Paolo Mancini returned home, but not on his own feet. He was carried, bleeding from a mortal wound. He had been ambushed by enemies of the family, men who had waited for the perfect moment to execute a long simmering vendetta. As his life slipped away like water through fingers, Rita held him. She prayed over him. She looked into his eyes with the same love she had shown for years. And in those final moments, Paolo died in peace, reconciled with God, and forgiven by his own conscience. It was a pain that would haunt Rita for the rest of her life, but it was also a triumph. Her husband's soul was saved. Rita's mourning was profound, and it was real. She did not hide behind empty, pious phrases. She wept for her husband. She prayed for his soul. And she continued to care for her sons with an aching heart. But there was something in her grief that shocked the people of Cascia. There was no trace of hatred in her. In a society where the vendetta was a sacred code, where killing your father's murderer was considered a son's highest duty, Rita made a choice that her neighbors could not comprehend. She forgave the men who had killed her husband. This forgiveness was not cowardice. It was the fruit of years spent meditating on the passion of Christ, looking at the one who cried out from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Rita had lived that prayer for so long that when the test came, she didn't have to search for mercy. It was already there, stored up in her heart like a reservoir of grace. But then she faced an even darker trial. Her 2 sons, now young men, burned with the desire for revenge. The code of family honor was pulling them toward a path that Rita knew would lead to the eternal perdition of their souls. She loved them with a mother's fierce tenderness, but she loved their salvation more than their earthly lives. And so, she prayed a prayer that only the logic of faith can understand. She asked God to take her sons, to bring them home to Him, before they could stain their hands with innocent blood. It was a prayer that cost her everything, a prayer that went against every natural maternal instinct, but she prayed it. God heard her. Both boys fell ill shortly after and died, but they died without the sin of murder on their souls. Rita wept as a mother, but she did not weep as one who was lost. She knew, with the ironclad certainty of her faith, that her sons had entered eternity with their souls intact. She was left alone, no husband, no children, standing on the darkest shore of her life. And it was from that very darkness that she heard, clearer than ever, the voice that had called her since she was a little girl, the voice of the cloister, the voice of the convent, the voice of God, waiting for her. Chapter 5. The Closed Doors. Rita arrived for the first time at the gates of the Augustinian monastery in Cascia, her heart full of hope. She was a woman who had taken a long time to arrive, but she arrived with a steady step. The nuns received her request. They listened to her story. They deliberated in their hushed halls, and they said no. The reasons were clear according to the customs of the time. Rita was a widow, not a virgin. The rules of the community gave preference to those who entered the convent without having lived the married state. To the world, the door was shut, but Rita knew that when God calls, no door remains closed forever. The heavy wooden door closed with a polite yet unyielding finality, and just like that, Rita returned to the stone-carved village of Roccaporena, her hands empty, her heart tested once more. It was another crushing blow for a woman who had already endured far too much, for a soul who had seen the world crumble around her time and again. Yet, those who watched her, expecting to see her spirit finally break, were met with a silence that defied understanding. Rita did not complain. She did not cast blame upon the sisters, nor did she ever question the mysterious ways of divine providence. She simply returned to her home. She deepened her prayer until it became her very breath. She fasted with a renewed and rigorous devotion, and she waited. It was not the hollow waiting of the defeated, but the active, vigilant expectation of one who knows that God's clock does not run on human time, and that the Creator is never, ever late. Months bled into seasons, and once again, Rita stood before that same sacred threshold. She knocked. The second refusal was just as courteous and just as absolute as the first. The sisters spoke gently of their ancient rules. They acknowledged Rita's undeniable virtues. They even lamented that they could not open the way for her. They suggested other paths, perhaps another convent, perhaps a different state of life. But that cloister, in that moment, remained a fortress she could not enter. For Rita, every no was not a rejection, but a divine opportunity, a chance to exercise the most difficult virtue of all, a humility that does not protest, a trust that does not waver, and a faith that burns brighter even when the darkness seems absolute. She walked away once more, her pace steady, though her heart burned with a holy, unquenchable longing. When Rita approached the convent for the third time, something about her presence had shifted. She seemed more serene, more translucent, as if the accumulation of her earthly sorrows, the death of her husband, the loss of her sons, the repeated rejections, had filed away the very last edges of her own self-will. She did not come to demand. She did not come to argue her case. She came only to ask, with the meekness of a beggar and the unshakable confidence of a daughter of the king. The sisters deliberated once more, and once more the answer was silence. 3 times the door of the convent had remained bolted shut against the woman who desired nothing more than to cross it. That night, in the small, candle-lit chapel of Roccaporena, Rita prayed with an intensity that the village would never forget. She did not ask for explanations. She did not try to negotiate with the Almighty. Instead, she placed her soul's deepest desire into the hands of the Lord with the total surrender of someone who has nothing left to lose. "If it is thy will, thou shalt open the way," she seemed to whisper with every beat of her heart. And the heavens, they were listening. That night, something that human hands could not achieve and human rules could not allow was about to unfold through the work of a providence that needs no keys to open what it wishes to unlock. Chapter 6. The Miracle of the Walls. The next morning, as the Augustinian Sisters of Cascia gathered for the office of laudes, they found Rita already inside the monastery. She was there, in the chapel, prostrate upon the cold stone floor, her eyes closed, her lips moving in a rhythmic, silent communion with God, as if she had been there for a lifetime. The doors were still locked from the inside. The high, formidable walls were intact. There was no human explanation for the sight before their eyes. Rita of Rocca had entered where there was no entrance. She had crossed the uncrossable. Tradition tells us that three great saints, St. Augustine, St. John the Baptist, and St. Nicholas of Tolentino, had gathered her up and preserved her through the air, placing her mysteriously within the heart of the cloister. The shock among the religious sisters was profound. Some crossed themselves in awe. Others ran to find the superior. When the Mother Abbess arrived and saw Rita lost in prayer, something in that scene spoke louder than any rulebook ever could. This woman had not forced her way in. She had not deceived anyone. She was simply there, in perfect peace, like a child who had finally arrived exactly where she belonged. The superior watched her in a long, heavy silence. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached out, touched Rita's shoulder, and told her that she could stay. The advocate of the impossible had finally come home. Rita's reception into the Augustinian community was the start of a new chapter, but it was not the end of her trials. The sisters, though shaken by the miracle, now had to integrate this extraordinary woman into the mundane, repetitive life of the convent. Rita did not enter with the pride of a victor. She arrived as the least among them, eager to perform the lowliest tasks, to occupy the humblest seat, to learn from every sister. Her spirit of service and her genuine simplicity soon melted away any lingering shadows of doubt. For Rita, the miracle of the walls was never a reason for pride, but a weight of immense responsibility. She knew God had placed her there for a purpose, and that purpose required her total cooperation. It was not enough to have entered. Now she had to grow. She had to die to herself every single day, responding to such an extraordinary grace with a life of extraordinary sacrifice. This miracle has always been seen by the Church as an unmistakable sign that Rita's vocation was woven by God from the beginning. What men had denied 3 times, divine providence granted in a single sovereign act, transcending every human custom. Rita had learned this truth in her own flesh, and the rest of her life would be a living echo of that lesson. Chapter 7. The Thorn of the Crown. Inside the cloister, Rita's piety found a deeper and more structured rhythm. The hours of divine office, the spiritual readings, the communal silence, everything served to mold a soul that had already been tempered by years of worldly fire. But nothing occupied her heart more than the passion of Christ. She meditated on the Lord's agony with an intensity that the other sisters watched with a mix of respect and a certain reverential fear. For Rita, the cross was not a mere symbol. It was the ultimate school of love, the key that unlocked every mystery of the human condition. One day, while kneeling before the crucifix in the chapel, Rita made a request that few would ever dare to utter. She asked to share in his sufferings, not in some vague, metaphorical way, but in a real, physical, and concrete manner. She wanted to feel in her own body a fragment of what Christ had endured in his passion. This was the prayer of a soul so consumed by love that she no longer feared pain. She craved it as a means of union with her beloved. This is the path of the great mystics, not a search for suffering for its own sake, but a desperate desire to be conformed to the image of the crucified King. The answer was instant, and it was visceral. From the crown of the crucifix before her, a single thorn detached itself, like a needle of light and bone, and struck Rita's forehead. It sank deep, piercing through the skin down to the very bone. The wound was jagged and deep and agonizing. It began to weep, and soon it released an odor that was difficult for those around her to bear. The sisters grew restless. The superior was filled with concern. Rita, however, bore the mark with a peace that surpassed all understanding. The king had shared his crown with her, yet Rita bore that open wound with a peace that astonished everyone who saw her. She did not complain. She did not beg for the pain to be taken away, and she never once asked for relief. To her, that bleeding gap in her forehead was the most precious token God had ever granted her. It was the physical seal of her union with the suffering of her beloved. The wound of the thorn stayed with Rita for the remainder of her life, with only one single, miraculous interruption. When the saint felt a burning desire to make a pilgrimage to Rome, to earn the graces of the great Jubilee, and to venerate the sacred tombs of the apostles, she made a humble request to the Lord. She asked him to temporarily close the wound, not to escape the pain, but so that she could travel without causing horror or rejection in those she met on the road. And divine providence listened. The wound closed completely, leaving only a faint scar. But the moment the pilgrimage ended, the moment she stepped back through the doors of her convent in Cascia, Rita knelt and prayed for the thorn to be restored to her. Immediately, the wound opened once more. This double miracle, the sudden healing and the intentional reopening, became one of the most talked about signs among those who lived in her shadow. The thorn from Christ's crown, etched into Rita's forehead, remains one of the most powerful symbols in the history of the Church. It is more than a miracle. It is an invitation. The Church has always seen in Rita a call for every soul to participate in the cross of Christ, each according to their own path, each according to their own strength. Not everyone is chosen for the visible marks of the stigmata, but everyone is called to die to themselves, to carry their daily cross, and to unite their hidden sorrows with those of the Redeemer. Rita simply lived out in the light what all the baptized are called to live in the shadows of their own hearts. Chapter 8. Life within the cloister. To the eyes of the world, Rita's daily life in the Augustinian convent was a life of narrow walls and harsh renunciation. But to those who truly understand the Spirit, it was a life of unbounded fullness. The rhythm of the divine office structured her soul from the first light of dawn until the deep silence of night. Lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally complin. Between these hours of prayer there was work, there was silence, and there was the study of the Holy Scriptures and the wisdom of the Church Fathers. Rita inhabited this rhythm with such a natural grace that it drew the eyes of all her sisters. To her, the rule was not an external weight, it was the very beat of her own heart. The mortifications she practiced were severe. Though they were always guided by the wise hand of her Mother Superior, she fasted often. She allowed herself only a few hours of sleep on the hard floor. She gave up those tiny comforts that even the rule allowed, yet she offered them up gladly. She did not do this because she hated the body. She did it because she loved the soul. She knew that the wild passions of the heart are only tamed when the body learns the discipline of voluntary sacrifice. It was an ancient spiritual medicine, a pedagogy of the saints, which she practiced with total fidelity and absolute discretion. But make no mistake, penance never cast a shadow over Rita's joy. She was known as one of the most serene women in the entire convent. She was a woman who could laugh with her sisters during recreation and then weep with profound compassion while meditating on the Passion of Christ. This combination of austerity and radiance is the mark of a true saint. It is not the sadness that condemns, but the joy that sets the soul free. The sisters who lived beside her every day found something in her company that they could not quite define, but simply being near her made their souls feel lighter. Her charity was the anchor of the community. When a sister fell ill, it was Rita who watched by her bedside through the long, dark hours of the night. When tensions rose within the cloister, for even behind sacred walls, human fragility remains. She was always the first to yield, the first to soften the harsh edges, the first to speak the words that restored the peace of Christ. She did not do this from a place of spiritual pride, but from the deep conviction that brotherly love is the first and most powerful testimony of faith. By this, the Lord had said, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. The years turned into decades, and Rita grew in the profound silence of God. She did not write complex theological books. She did not give famous speeches. Her teaching was her life, a life lived with total consistency, a life of persistent prayer, a life of concrete love that never sought the applause of men. Without ever seeking it, she won the deep veneration of her sisters and the faithful who began to flock to the convent gates. She interceded for everyone, for the poor, for the sick, for the sinners, and for families torn apart by conflict. Her small cell became a tribunal of mercy, where no one ever left empty-handed. Chapter 9. The Rose and the Fig. After many long years of religious life, a grave illness took hold of Rita's weary body. Her strength began to fade, slowly, inevitably, until the day came when she could no longer rise from her bed. The doctors who visited her could only shake their heads in sorrow. Her body was a map of 1,000 sacrifices, worn down by years of penance and the constant ache of the thorn. Humanly speaking, she was a woman broken, but her eyes told a different story. They remained bright, serene, and luminous, like the clear water of a mountain spring. One day in the heart of January, the coldest month in the hills of Umbria, when the snow buried the rooftops and the earth lay in a frozen sleep, a relative came to visit her. Rita spoke softly of her old home in Roccaporena, of the small garden she had tended so many years ago, a garden that now lay abandoned under the ice. "Go to the garden," Rita said with a calm smile, "and bring me a rose." The woman looked at her with confusion. A rose? In January, the bitter frost had killed everything green. The plants were sleeping deep beneath the white shroud of winter. It was impossible. But there was a light in Rita's eyes that silenced any argument. When she reached the garden in Roccaporena and laid her eyes upon the rose bushes, she froze in her tracks. There, standing out against the white frost and the frozen earth, a single red rose bloomed with a scandalous vitality. It looked as if the winter did not exist, as if time itself had paused to make an exception for this one flower. With trembling hands, she plucked it and rushed back to the convent. Rita received the flower with a quiet smile, like someone receiving a guest she had been expecting all along. The sisters who saw it could not find words, and from that day on, the rose became the eternal symbol of the saint of the impossible. But the garden had one more miracle to give. Before she left, Rita made a second request. "Look at the old fig tree in the orchard, and bring me 2 figs." In January, from a tree that had been skeletal and bare for months. This time, the woman did not doubt. She had learned that day that the limits of the possible do not apply to the friends of God. She went to the tree, and there they were, 2 ripe figs hidden among the dry, leafless branches, like tiny vegetable miracles waiting to be gathered. She brought them to the convent and placed them in Rita's hands. The rose and the fig of winter are more than just beautiful stories. They are the signature of God, proof that even in the coldest, deadest winter of the soul, grace can bring forth life. Chapter 10. The Glorious Sunset. The final years of Rita within the hallowed walls of the Cascia convent were a slow, luminous, and profound consummation. Her physical frame continued to weaken, yet her spirit seemed to soar in inverse proportion to the strength she lost. Those who visited her at her bedside described an experience that defied all logic. They would enter the room heavy-hearted, burdened with worry for her, only to leave feeling deeply consoled by her. It was the sick woman who gave strength to the healthy. It was the bedridden saint who sustained those who could still walk. There was a peace in her presence that was not manufactured with clever words, but was felt much like one feels the radiant heat of a great fire, without any need for someone to announce its warmth. Rita spent those final days in a state of uninterrupted prayer. She followed the daily offices of the monastery from her small, humble cell, lifting her frail, trembling voice to join the sisters singing in the choir from afar. She meditated on the mysteries of the life of Christ with the meticulousness of someone walking a beloved path for the very last time, wanting to etch every stone and shadow into her memory. She found her greatest solace in the meditation of the Passion. In the excruciating pains of our Lord, she did not find a reason for sorrow, but a wellspring of hope, because she knew with every fiber of her being that on the other side of the cross, the resurrection was waiting. This absolute conviction gave her a serenity that left every visitor in awe. For 5 long years, Rita remained bedridden on that couch of suffering. 5 years where time was not measured in hours, but in graces received, not in days, but in acts of sacrificial love offered to the Father. The illness advanced with a cold cruelty, yet Rita never allowed it to steal her joy. Every sharp pain, every moment of exhaustion, was offered back to the Lord with the same spirit she had cultivated since her youth. She united her own sufferings to those of Christ, ensuring that they were never wasted, that they were not a loss, but a divine gain, transforming her personal cross into an instrument of salvation for souls she would never meet. On May 22nd, 1457, which was then the Feast of St. Monica, Rita of Cascia finally stepped across the threshold into eternity. Those present at her passing spoke of a miracle. Her face, in the moment of her transit, took on a serenity and a radiant beauty that surpassed all natural explanation. The wound from the thorn, which had been her mark of mystical union for years, suddenly transformed. Instead of the odor of decay, it released a sweet, celestial fragrance that flooded the entire cell. At that same moment, the bells of the convent began to ring on their own, sounding a peal of victory that no human hand had started. An unusual and supernatural light was said to have illuminated the room. The body of Rita remained incorrupt, defying the laws of death, and thus it remains venerated centuries later in the great Basilica of Cascia. The people of the region flocked in massive numbers to venerate her remains. From the very first days, reports began to pour in of extraordinary graces and intercessions obtained through her name. The sick who invoked her were healed. Families torn apart by generations of conflict found the grace of reconciliation at her tomb. Causes that seemed utterly lost took sudden, unexpected turns. Thus began, in a spontaneous and popular explosion of faith, a devotion that the Church would take centuries to officially recognize, but which the faithful had known in their hearts from the very start. Rita of Cascia was a saint, and her intercession was a sure path to the mercy of God. Chapter 11. The Patroness of Impossible Causes. The cause for the beatification of Rita of Cascia was formally opened, navigating the slow and rigorous paths of the Holy See. The Catholic Church does not proclaim saints lightly. It scrutinizes every virtue, investigates every miracle attributed to the candidate's intercession, and weighs the evidence with the highest rigor. In Rita's case, the mountain of testimonies was so vast and so well documented that the process, though extensive, found solid answers to every doubt. Finally, on May 24th, 1900, Pope Leo XIII solemnly inscribed her into the catalogue of saints for the Universal Church. Her canonization was a moment of overflowing joy for millions of the faithful who had been venerating Rita for centuries, always remaining faithful to the authority of Rome. The Basilica of Cascia, which had already witnessed countless miracles, became one of the most visited shrines in all of Italy. Pilgrims from every corner of the globe began to arrive, the rich and the poor, the learned and the illiterate, people of ironclad faith and those who arrived with hearts full of doubt, yet desperate for someone to hear their cry. No one felt out of place before the tomb of Rita, because she was a mother to all. The title the people gave her long before the Vatican spoke is the one that has remained forever, the Saint of the Impossible. This was not a title born of theological study, but of human experience, born from the raw reality of thousands who turned to her when they had nowhere else to go. The abandoned spouse, the mother weeping for a lost child, the patient that doctors had given up on, the sinner who felt they were beyond the reach of God's mercy. They all found in Rita an intercessor who was not afraid of their darkness, because she had lived through situations that seemed to have no exit. The spread of her devotion across Latin America, Spain, the Philippines, and Africa speaks of something that transcends cultural boundaries and time. Rita touches something deep within the human soul, the need to know that when everything humanly possible has failed, the possibility of God remains. The Gospel teaches us that. With man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. And Rita of Cascia is the living incarnation of that promise. She is the woman who spent her life proving that God never abandons those who place their trust in Him. Today, the incorrupt body of Saint Rita rests in the Basilica of Cascia, inside a crystal urn that allows the world to gaze upon her features more than 500 years after her death. Thousands of devotees still make the pilgrimage every year, leaving flowers, especially roses in memory of that January miracle, and placing their petitions, written on small slips of paper, by her side. Those papers, those roses, those silent tears are the vocabulary with which the faithful have spoken to their saint for centuries, and tradition, backed by countless miracles, affirms that she listens, she intercedes, and she never forgets a single soul who calls upon her name with faith. O Saint Rita of Cascia, woman of a faith that could not be shaken, you who endured the deepest agonies of this life without ever losing the profound peace of your heart, from that celestial height where you now gaze upon the face of Almighty God. Face to face, we ask you to turn your merciful eyes toward us, toward those of us still wandering through the shadowed valleys of this weary world, you who knew the stinging pain of loss, the biting cold of rejection, and the crushing weight of utter loneliness. You are the perfect intercessor for those of us who carry wounds that we simply do not know how to heal. We implore you to present before the throne of divine mercy every heavy burden, every silent tear, and every need that we place into your hands today, fully convinced that your intercession holds mighty power before Him who can do all things. You who loved your husband with a fidelity that defied logic, with a patience that could only come from heaven itself. You who transformed a home of strife and violence into a sacred corner of grace, Intercede now for every family torn apart by the jagged edges of conflict, by the poison of infidelity, or the cold silence of lost love. May the Lord pour out upon them that same tenderness with which you shielded your own home. We ask you to plead for those spouses who have lost all hope in their marriage, that they may find in prayer and in the strength of sacramental grace the power to begin again. May no home crumble into ruins without first receiving the grace to try one more time, with God placed firmly at the center. Saint Rita, our beloved patroness of impossible causes, we lay at your feet everything we have long stopped asking for, because our hearts grew tired, because we stopped believing it could ever change. We bring you the illnesses that medicine has labeled incurable, the reconciliations that the world considers unrealistic, the conversions that seem beyond reach, and the dreams that time and failure have buried under the dust of the years. You know well what it means to face closed doors, for you saw them shut against you from the inside. Therefore, do not tell us to be silent in our petition, but walk with us. Lead us before the God who can make a rose bloom in the dead of winter, the God who can bring forth fruit from the very tree that everyone else had given up for dead. You who bore upon your own forehead the sacred thorn from the crown of Christ, teach us to embrace our own sufferings without the bitterness of soul and without the darkness of despair. Help us to understand that pain is never the final word, that the cross is not the end, but the threshold to something greater. When sickness, injustice, loss, or failure come to visit our door, let your example remind us that it is possible to suffer with dignity, with peace, and even with a supernatural joy. Let us learn from you that suffering united to the passion of Christ is never wasted, never. Instead, it becomes a seed of life for us, and for those we love most dearly. Saint Rita of Cascia, advocate of those who no longer know where to turn, receive our prayer today with that same radical kindness with which you received all who approached you during your life on earth. Take into the Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ our sorrows, our doubts, our sins, and our flickering hopes, and above all, obtain for us the most important grace of all, not just the immediate solution to our problems, but a faith that does not flicker out, a hope that refuses to surrender, and a love that perseveres until the end. Grant that one day we may join you in the house of the Father, in that kingdom where there are no more impossibilities, only the eternal joy of being lost in God forever. Amen.